I'm Chris Sikkema, and a few years ago when I was in graduate school, I made a point to visit the Episcopal Chapel on campus. As a jaded student, I knew what I was expecting. A lukewarm but reliable sermon, a few students sitting 5 rows behind a couple campus stalwarts, and me getting out unchanged after 57 minutes. What I found was the opposite. A house of God with a passionate, expressive, and barefoot priest calling us to turn around in our lives and in our communities, to listen for God's call and choose to follow Jesus wherever he leads. I came back to Nashville to meet with that extraordinary priest and learn about how she put that turning into practice. The Reverend Dr. Becca Stevens.
Morning.
Good morning. It's so good to be with you this morning. We're going to talk about the way of love, Bishop Curry and the Episcopal Church's 7 practices for Jesus-centered life. And we're going to start with turn today. First of all, just 50,000-foot overview. What is Thistle Farms?
Sure. Thistle Farms is a community for women's freedom. We began as a residential program here in Nashville, Tennessee, and then developed into social justice enterprises. Then we developed a national network, and then we developed a global network. Now more than 1,800 women around the world are part of our global marketplace. There's more than 210 beds here in the U.S. that are long-term free beds for women who are surviving trafficking, prostitution, and addiction.
Behind us is a shop where they have body care products, artwork, clothing. Where did all of that come from?
My theology is pretty practical. And it's like, oh, we can make healing oils and candles. I'm a priest, that's what I know how to make, right? So we started that, and it just grew and grew and grew. The idea was to achieve economic independence for women. And the women needed to get out of poverty. The violence and vulnerability of poverty is one of the reasons women continue to turn toward the streets. If we were going to be a growing justice enterprise, and I use the word justice enterprise more than social enterprise, sure, because I think justice enterprise means the women are the workforce, is the mission.
Yep.
You know, that's the whole thing. It's not just a social enterprise where we make anything and it doesn't matter. It's very rooted in our theology and in our justice language. So it kept expanding, the lines kept expanding. And then women also didn't want just like a cottage industry where they came in for 6 months. They want careers and lives.
That's right.
So now I think 6 departments are headed up by graduates and hundreds of women are employed, and we just kept growing.
Turning isn't something that you just do to begin every single day, although you might, but it's an intentional practice of pausing, listening, and choosing to follow Jesus. It's kind of reorienting yourself throughout the day, throughout your own life, back toward God from whatever may have called us away from God. So I wonder, do you have any stories in your own personal life about turning?
One of the stories of turning that I really remember profoundly is being a young ordained priest. And I had a little baby, another one on the way, and I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to start a community that was justice oriented, that was loving, that was all those things, but I wasn't doing any of it. One day I had my young son, I was trying to get him in the car seat, and he was doing that thing that little kids do, which is arch your back and not let you get him in, and I was struggling, and I realized he's looking up, and he was looking at this huge sign of a woman dressed up like a cap, and he said, "Mama, why is that lady smiling?" That question just struck a chord in me, and it was like a heartbreaking question, thinking someday my little boy's not going to ask that question. He thinks it'll be like part of the landscape, it'll be part of the understanding that we do buy and sell women and dress them up like cats and sell them probably for less than cats and want them to smile the whole time. And that day was a day that I thought, I'm doing this. I'm going to let him know that he was raised by a woman who wants him to love and respect the dignity of every single person. That was the day I started.
Yeah. Even in that moment, a child being willful and not wanting to be in the car seat, it's almost like the voice of God came through that action.
Absolutely.
And you were able to perceive that, and that's a gift that I hope all Episcopalians and really all people start to realize, is that God comes to us in those moments, and they can be those simple times where it's that voice saying, there's another way.
And the grace is really when we're open to hearing it.
Right.
Why that day was I in that space where it was like, okay, it's time to do something.
Yeah. When you get turned around, what are some practices that you undertake in daily life to help reorient you?
I mean, I wrote a whole book called Love Heals.
Yeah.
It's my theology as best I can do it. And I wrote this, literally a whole book on these ways that we can do a practice daily and have specific ways and consistent ways that allow us to be able to turn easier. It doesn't have to be anything big. It can be, I get up in the morning, have a cup of tea, light a candle, and take one breath. And that in itself is a turning.
And it's not always this massive thing where the voice of God comes down and says, change now. Sometimes it's those little daily turns.
Well, that's why we start every day in a circle at Thistle Farm. People come in and we light the candle. And we just say we light the candle for the woman on the street, the woman trying to find her way home, because that turns us to why we're here, what we need to do.
Amen. What do you think Thistle Farms has done to help turn the attitudes of folks in Nashville back toward God, toward love?
We started back before there even anybody was using the term human trafficking. Back when we were starting, you know, we were still blaming 14-year-old girls on the streets that were addicted to crack cocaine. Women are victimized way before they're criminals. And on average, the women that we serve are first raped between the ages of 7 and 11. And so they first hit the streets between the ages of like 14 and 16. And so the turning is the idea that none of them got there by themselves.
That's right.
It takes communities, broken churches, broken education systems, broken penal systems to get them there. And so it seems like it makes sense that it takes a community, a whole community, to welcome them home. What we can do is we can be a part of that community. It's the same thing I've heard all over the world. You know, we have 26 global partners now. First thing is women want jobs. If they're in prison, they want jobs, they want a house, they want education for themselves and their kids, they want independence from whatever abusive systems they were in. When the community can turn and provide the time and the space, then women can turn. I don't know if you heard this morning when the woman who is just graduating our 2-year residential program, and she said, "Thank you for helping me save my life." That is what turning is.
That's right.
It's not me going like, you need to go this way, you need to do this. It's me saying, I'd love to give you the time and space for you to figure out what that looks like for you.
Absolutely. And I think that's more long-lasting too. I mean, we try repeatedly on a massive scale to say, this is the correct step for you, go take it. And why didn't you take that thing?
Well, you know, you see those pyramids, you know, they have the neat steps where you reach the top of the pyramid and it's like, okay, that's never happened in my life.
Right.
What I need is I need not this pyramid that I'm climbing, but a circle of love that I'm abiding in.
Which is what I think the church can be on its very best days.
Yeah, that'd be awesome.
Wouldn't it? During communion, we sometimes pray that God would open our eyes to his work in the world around us. We pray that we could come to God's table not only for solace, but also for strength. Not only for pardon, but also for renewal. We visited St. Augustine's chapel where Thistle Farms was born, and from the joyful photos of their river baptisms to their simple wooden altar, this place speaks of reorienting ourselves to a new life, just like that prayer.
To me, turning isn't always like starting something brand new.
Right.
Sometimes it's like just living into something really old and beautiful. And I was thinking about my dad, who was an Episcopal priest. I mean, he died when I was very, very little. He was killed by a drunk driver. You know, he thought the end of the church would be if women were ever allowed to be acolytes.
Wow.
Yeah, that's what kind of dude he was. So it needed to be transformed and turned, and the church did all that work so I could step into it.
Yeah.
And I stepped into something really beautifully old and sacred, but it was new.
You know, that's one of the things that we, with the Way of Love, the idea is none of these practices are a part of a larger program that in 3 years are going to go away and then we'll be on to the next thing. These are ancient practices. These are things that our forebears have done 2,000 years ago. And it's something that brings us closer to God over time. And I think in the process, closer to each other.
That's what I've always said about our community at Thistle Farms. This is Benedictine stuff. This is old stuff that we're turning toward.
That's right.
And in a beautiful and loving way that's non-judgmental, that's radical.
You know, I'm reminded from graduate school, we talked about how things aren't necessarily evil, but that people are oriented away from God. And that's what evil actually is. And that it's this slow turning back and recognition over and over again, like a boat in really choppy waters. You're never perfectly turned all the way back toward God, but for those brief moments you are. And it's constant work to turn back.
In my work with women for more than 20 years, coming out of prison and off the streets, sometimes I realize we've set women on that course, a sea and a way. And at least for me, the idea is, they have to do a lot of the forgiving. And there's freedom in that, and there is a turning in that too. It wasn't like they turned. A lot of times they were turned.
Yeah.
What we try to do here is ask the story, not what you do, but what happened. How did you end up on the sea in that boat? And what does it take for all of us to join you in turning it? I think it's too much for people sometimes to think, I cannot turn this boat around by myself.
That's right.
I can't. And I feel that in my own life too. I mean, I have a history of sexual abuse that started in the church right after my dad died. And I got really lost at sea sometimes. And I would say it is, some really amazing, forgiving, loving people who helped me turn that boat around.
Look at the fruit of that forgiveness, the turning, that recognition of horror. Being able to turn has created all of this with a lot of help from the community,
Oh my gosh,
from the
yes.
survivors,
Absolutely.
from these women, from God.
If you're a part of a church community or any kind of healing place, it's much easier to turn.
Mark tells us that Jesus was walking along one day and met a tax collector named Levi sitting at a tax booth. He simply said, "Follow me," and he followed. In our daily lives and in the lives of our communities, I hope we can listen for the voice that even now invites us to new life. I hope we can turn toward it strengthened and renewed, falling in love with Jesus again and again and again. Next time on Traveling the Way of Love. So it's a beautiful day in St. Petersburg, but it's not always that way here.
No. Back in 2017, St. Pete was going to get hit with a really big one. One of the ways that we do prepare for hurricanes is you shut down streets and you shut down buildings. So the cathedral shut down. The next thing you know, the doors are just locked and everyone is just holed up. You are immediately stripped away from anything that brings you comfort.
So how did you come up with a way to counteract that isolation in the midst of that, absolutely terrifying situation for folks?
Hey everyone, happy pop-up prayer. I'm the Reverend Candy Katie Churchwell, your Facebook priest. It's good to be with you today.
We just started going live on Facebook. We did Compline and we did devotions in the morning. You see me sitting in exercise clothes of all things and in a dark bedroom because the power had already gone out. And that was it. It just became this thing that while the doors were closed at the cathedral, you could find worship, you could find prayer, you could find community, and you could really find God's presence.